And so, on to our first speaker of the day. I'd like to introduce Professor Mark Meadow, who is the head of art and architecture and chair of department at the University of California at Santa Barbara. After earlier careers as a Baroque oboist, a house painter, a music publisher, Mark became a specialist in Northern Renaissance art and the history and theory of museums. Techne lies behind Mark's approach. As I say, currently chair of the Department of History of Art at Santa Barbara. His research interests include the relationship of art and rhetoric, early modern ritual and spectacle, print culture, social networks, and most recently, the origins of the Kunst and Wunderkammer. He's the author of many articles and the monograph Peter Bruegel the Elder's Netherlandish Proverbs and the Practice of Rhetoric of 2002, and has produced translations and critical editions of two important 16th century sources, Simon Andriesen's 1550 Deutsche Adagia of the Sprichworten, if you'll excuse my Dutch accent, and with Bruce Robertson, Samuel Quiccheberg's 1565 Inscriptiones vel tituli, Theatri, amplissimi. He's the co-founder and editorial board member of the book series Proteus, Studies in Identity Formation in Early Modern Language, Text, Ritual, Habitat, with Brepols, publishers in Belgium. He's been the recipient of many awards and fellowships from the Cress, the Mellon, the Belgian-American Education Foundation, the J. Paul Getty Grant Program, the Delmas Foundation, and so on and so forth. The list is too great to enumerate. And so with that, I'd like to invite you to the podium. Welcome.
So it's a great pleasure to be here today. My thanks to Andrew, to Peter, to Laura Minsky for all of the organizational help with today's meeting. Before I begin my presentation, I want to echo something that Peter said in his introduction in terms of the perceived centrality of the library in universities in terms of knowledge production versus the museum. And indeed, what we will be doing today is exploring the notion of how collections, how museums become central to the concept of knowledge production in the European tradition from the 16th century, but also how they connect to the very practical utility of administering governments. Which is a role for collections, for research institutes that we do take for granted today, the notion that there are such things as national museums, but have not until very recently considered in reference to the earliest form of institutional collecting, which are the Kunst and Wunderkammer that will be recurring in talks throughout the day. Let me begin. In early 1565, Leo Quiccheberg traveled to Italy with a manuscript version of his brother Samuel's treatise on Kunstkammer, which would be published in Munich later that year under the title Inscriptiones vel tituli, Theatri, amplissimi. As a manuscript, which is now in the Vatican Library, indicates, Leo hoped to secure two things for his brother while in Italy: a publisher in Venice and the patronage of Emperor Maximilian II. The second aim is evident from a dedicatory preface to Maximilian, written in German by Leo, in which he seeks to convince the emperor to sponsor Samuel and his treatise. The primary argument he sets forth is found towards the end of the preface. Because I know of no king, no prince, no potentate who cannot find something that will amuse him and show what, from founding a theater of this sort, might be gained for your Majesty's prudence from such a Kunstwunderkammer. This is a noteworthy statement in a number of ways. First, it is, at least to my knowledge, unique in employing the noun, the compound noun, Kunst-Wunderkammer. For that matter, Samuel's treatise appears to be the earliest use we have of the word Wunderkammer, introducing both terms into the vocabulary. Next, Leo exhorts Maximilian to read and possibly to underwrite publishing the treatise because it will be useful to him. The term Leo employs for that utility, prudentia, is one of the few in the preface to be written in Latin, presumably because there is no exact translation for it in 16th century German. As I will discuss in this paper, prudentia refers quite specifically to the form of contingent knowledge or wisdom required by a ruler in order to govern effectively, as proposed initially by Aristotle. This explains the pleonasm at the beginning of the sentence, kein König, kein Fürst oder Potentat. The founder of the Kunstwunderkammer, or as Samuel calls it, Theatrum Sapientiae, is conceived in the treatise first and foremost as something of interest and practical use to rulers and as a central element in an envisioned apparatus of a newly created centralized government. In these arguments, Leo Quiccheberg echoes the argument made in the treatise itself, starting with its title. In the complete title of the published text, Samuel announces that his most ample theater might rightly be called a repository of artificial and marvelous things and of every rare treasure, precious object, construction, and picture. It is recommended that these things be brought together here in the theater so that by their frequent viewing and handling, one might quickly, easily, and confidently be able to command a knowledge and admirable understanding of things. Here, too, I want to signal a couple of important concepts. The terms Quiccheberg uses for what is to be gained by the assembling and use of the vast collection his treatise prescribes are quite specifically cognitio and prudentia. Prudentia, which you've already encountered, and which I will explain in greater detail in the course of my paper as it pertains to the text, is a specific form of knowledge required by rulers to respond to the contingencies of government. For now, it is simply worth noting that by placing the term on his title page, Samuel is signaling the primary readership of his treatise. Elsewhere, he indicates that even those of lesser means may still wish to establish more limited or specialized collections, but it is to princes and potentates that he is speaking. As I've suggested before, one way of understanding his treatise is as a form of job application, either for continued employment with his current patron, Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria, or, as Leo's dedication hints, a new position, a possible new position, which never materialized with the Habsburg Emperor. If the ruler's prudentia is the end goal, the final cause of the collection Quiccheberg proposes, cognitio is the process by which this knowledge is acquired, a mode of knowledge production, if you will. Cognitio refers to the kind of knowledge that is gained through an active process of study or becoming acquainted with something through repeated exposure, and so might also have been translated as an admirable familiarity. We retain the sense of cognitio in the modern English word recognition, to know something with which we are already familiar, or to know something again with which we are already familiar. That this sense of cognition is what Quiccheberg had in mind is made clear by the preceding recommendation of how to use the multitude of collected materials by their frequent viewing and handling, frequenti inspectione tractationeque. The prince gains the needed unique knowledge and admirable understanding of things, and therefore presumably rules most wisely. Quiccheberg thus explicitly announces that the collection is to be used in an active fashion, that the objects in the collection are both to be seen and physically handled, actually used on a frequent basis. This is much closer to what is done today with objects in university research collections and laboratories than how we are expected to behave in modern art museums. In working through just what is meant by Quiccheberg's use of prudence, I should note from the outset that I will be disagreeing with a recent statement about the treatise. So, that Quiccheberg's Inscriptiones is technical and concrete rather than theoretical and abstract. Now, I've always cautioned my own graduate students never to begin a talk with a straw man argument, pointing out what other scholars have gotten wrong. In this case, I think it's okay to do so because this is my own statement. So this is in the introduction to the translation of Quiccheberg that Bruce Robertson and I produced. I should be clear, I have not changed my mind about Quiccheberg being technical and concrete. If anything, I'm still further convinced that his book was meant as a very pragmatic guide to creating and managing a large-scale museum, an ideal princely Kunst and Wunderkammer. This can be seen most obviously in Quiccheberg's obsession with museum furniture, cabinets, display cases, shelves, and so forth, but also in his discussion of designing museum architecture for optimal viewing conditions and of strategies for acquiring new objects, and of linking the display spaces to a range of craft workshops and research laboratories, which I'll discuss in a minute. But since I began looking into what he meant by prudentia, first in Leo's dedication and in Samuel's title, I've concluded that Quiccheberg, in fact, had quite serious ambitions to put forward a system today that we would indeed call theoretical. And this despite the fact that Quiccheberg goes somewhat out of his way to deny this fact. The reason for this apparent paradox lies in the distinction among different kinds of knowledge and the appropriate uses for them, especially as discussed by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. By invoking prudence, Quiccheberg very clearly refers to practical knowledge, to a kind of wisdom that can be applied to real-life situations, especially those of governing a state. In the Nicomachean Ethics, the text, and this is a text which Quiccheberg, as a university-trained physician and humanist, was certainly familiar. Aristotle carefully distinguishes phronesis, practical knowledge, which in Latin is called prudentia or prudence, from two other kinds of knowledge. These are episteme, also known as scientia, which is the knowledge of philosophers, mathematicians, and theologians. It is knowledge that proceeds from first principles, that is, from things that must necessarily be true and that therefore are eternal. This kind of theoretical knowledge has the advantage that what it teaches can be known absolutely, can be said to be definitively true or false, but it has the disadvantage, according to Aristotle, that it isn't of much help in dealing with the real world. The clear truths that episteme addresses can be demonstrated, which is what mathematicians and philosophers do, but they cannot be discussed or deliberated since they are not open to question. The other kind of knowledge that Aristotle contrasts with phronesis or prudence is techne, which very roughly corresponds to the knowledge held by a skilled craftsman or technician, such as a shoemaker or an architect, though it also encompasses the refined skills of an orator or a musician who produce more intangible things. Techne is ultimately bound to making things, whether shoes, buildings, speeches, or musical performances. Once made, the process has ended. So again, for Aristotle, there is a finality to techne that again does not lend itself to deliberation. Aristotle distinguishes techne from phronesis, characterizing the former as productive knowledge and the latter as practical knowledge. In most instances, the productivity of techne refers to the material creation of things that one might expect. A shoemaker produces shoes, a builder produces houses, a barrel maker produces barrels, but as I've said, it can also refer to more intangible outcomes, as when the techne of a physician produces health in the patient. Practical knowledge, or prudence, in contrast, is what is needed when faced with the need to make decisions and to act in the face of uncertainty. This uncertainty arises in different ways. One is that external circumstances, social, political, or physical, change constantly, and so actions have to be modified to fit them. The other is that there are many situations, again, social, political, or ethical, in which multiple points of view can be validly maintained at the same time. In other words, phronesis is what is required to deal with contingency, to deal with possibilities, rather than certainties. For a ruler, the quintessential prudential thinker, the constantly changing circumstances mean that there is never an end to governing. Since any issue can be decided in different ways, balancing relative advantages and disadvantages, then there are always multiple points of view to be considered, and there must be continual discussion, debate, and compromise. At this point, I just want to suggest a few things about what I think is going on in Quiccheberg in his use of prudence. First, the treatise is addressed to a ruling prince, Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria, who Quiccheberg hoped would continue to employ him to manage his collections, so the proposed connection of the Kunstkammer to prudence and wise rulership was very much to the point. Next, with his connections to the Duke in mind, I think Quiccheberg is in fact attempting a sort of grand unified theory of Aristotelian knowledge, subsuming techne in particular, but even episteme under the prudence of the ruler. Third, and this is what I think is truly radical about Quiccheberg's project, is that he argues that the prudent administration of a state can best be accomplished through the study and use of myriad collected specimens, artifacts, tools, and machines. In other words, that virtuous and enlightened government depends on the collecting and study of material culture. Within the second section of the Inscriptiones that is entitled The Recommendation and Advice, in which Quiccheberg most fully provides a rationale for establishing a princely Kunst-Wunderkammer, he explains the purpose of assembling such vast encyclopedic collections. I wanted, with this most complete and universal enumeration of everything that could be collected, to add these things to the consideration of men, just as Cicero did with regard to the complete orator. Thus, on the basis of these classes, they might measure the magnitude of their knowledge of all things, and they might be stimulated to imagine and investigate other matters in turn. The reference is to Cicero's assertion that the ideal orator should be conversant in all fields of knowledge, since he may be called upon to discourse fluently on any topic. In this passage, then, Quiccheberg begins to link this notion of encyclopedic knowledge with the ability to respond to changing circumstances, to imagine and investigate other matters in turn, which is precisely what a prudential ruler is expected to do. That this is linked to wise governance is confirmed by the passage that immediately follows. Indeed, I also judge that it cannot be expressed by any person's eloquence how much prudence and utility in administering the state, quanta prudentia et usus administrandæ reipublicæ, as much in the civil and military spheres as in the ecclesiastical and scholarly, can be gained from the examination and study, again, cognitio, of the images and objects that we are prescribing. Quiccheberg, who worked for Albrecht V, confidently asserts that the Kunstkammer is intended as a specifically prudent instrument of statecraft, of vital use to Albrecht as the first ruler of a centrally administered, newly unified Bavaria. I don't think it's any accident that this concept emerges as Bavaria converts to a centralized, unified government under Albrecht V. In Quiccheberg's argument, the Kunstkammer is a pragmatic facility for enhancing the state economy, consolidating state religion, especially Catholic religion, given that he's addressing Albrecht V of Bavaria and potentially Maximilian II in the wake of the Augsburg Peace, strengthening the military in a particularly troubled period, and promoting scholarship and culture. Threaded through the treatise are numerous suggestions about how a collection might further state administration in these specific areas. In military terms, images of battles and sieges are collected under Class 1 Inscription 6 so that, quote, owing to their value in relation to certain diverse successes and to the practical knowledge of things they provide, they should be placed before the eyes of Christians. Similarly, under Class 4, Inscription 9, Class 4 is the section of the treatise dealing with tools and instruments, Quiccheberg suggests collecting weapons of foreign nations, and other very unusual and effective arms, such as scimitars, bows, ballistas, spears, quivers, and slings, and whatever else is so rare that it seems as fit for making a collection admirable as for equipping an arsenal. In a later digression on this same inscription, he explains that these weapons are of the most diverse and practical employment, and that it will be useful to, and again I quote, compare foreign weapons with our own and old with new. The fourth inscription of Class 4, which is devoted to instruments of force, and that is to say levers, pulleys, and other simple machines, includes siege tools for breaking gates, hinges, irons, etc. In a different section of the treatise, which describes workshops and laboratories associated with the collection, he proposes two kinds of armories. The first for collecting ceremonial arms and armor to be used in jousts, processions, and other festivities, an important aspect of court life, but another to quote, supply entire armies, defend walls, destroy fleets, and try to shatter ramparts. He also prescribes a foundry in which such arms can be produced. For the administration of religion, it is worth noting again that the treatise is written only 10 years following the Augsburg Peace, with its principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose region, whose territory, his religion, which established for the first time in the German-speaking realm the concept of a state religion. Within Quiccheberg's collection proper, religious materials only enter in the form of biblical paintings in the very first inscription and in the collection of printed images located in the fifth class, Inscription 3. But within his discussion of museums, workshops, and laboratories associated with the Kunstkammer, Quiccheberg includes the chapel as a kind of workshop and as a site for collecting sacred images, liturgical vessels, and liturgical vestments. With the Munich court in mind, we might remember the enormous collection assembled by Albrecht V and his successors of relics and reliquaries, liturgical accoutrements, and religious imagery. In terms of administering the civil sphere of the state, Quiccheberg largely constructs an argument based on the relationship between technology and economic development. For example, in his initial list of inscriptions in Class 1, he proposes that one can collect, and this is one of my favorite passages in the treatise, one can collect tiny models of machines, such as those for drawing water or cutting wood into boards or grinding grain, driving piles, propelling boats, stopping floods, and the like. On the basis of these models of little machines and constructions, other larger ones can be properly built and subsequently better ones invented. In other words, these are to be working scale models. Their miniature size is expedient in terms of cost and space. More models can be collected than full-scale ones could, allowing a wider range of variations for purposes of comparison. The kinds of machines Quiccheberg names pertain to state-level enterprises: hydraulic engineering, building construction, mining, agriculture, and disaster management. The idea seems to be that when the need arose, a new mine that demands innovative machinery, for example, that the models can be consulted and compared. What is odd about Quiccheberg's suggestion, though, is that miniaturized working machine models were virtually unknown in his own day, only showing up in the later 17th and especially the 18th century. So Quiccheberg is in fact projecting or inventing a new kind of object, imagining a new kind of object, and a new form of collecting and study that we might call comparative engineering in order to advance his larger argument concerning political and economic utility. The economic benefit of such technological developments are twofold: improved efficiency in key economic sectors, including the fostering of new industries and the development of innovative technology as a commodity in its own right. The Fuggers of Augsburg, who were Quiccheberg's first employers, and especially Georg Fugger, commissioned what were described as mathematical instruments we would today call scientific instruments from local goldsmiths beginning in the 1520s. At least partly as a result of this patronage, a profitable instrument-making industry developed in Augsburg in the second half of the 16th century, which would persist for nearly 2 centuries. The Fuggers acquired their own vast wealth by securing loans to the Habsburgs against copper and silver mines, many of which reverted permanently into their possession. So the promotion of high-end instrument production in Augsburg would have been doubly profitable. They supplied the raw materials, the copper alloys, and brokered the sales of the finished products, the tools and instruments that these instrument makers produced, with the added benefit then of promoting the overall economy of Augsburg. A similar example is the 16th century Medici patronage of Pietro Dure workshops, leading to Ferdinando I's founding of the still extant, it still exists today, Officio della Pietro Dure in Florence. Here I'm showing you a 16th century Kunstkammer made in Florence. You travel to Florence today, you can still buy Pietro Dure work. So a luxury industry was created in Florence that has now persisted for centuries through Medici patronage in their collections. Now, connected to the Kunstkammer, as I'm showing you in this diagram, are an entire system of museums, workshops, and storerooms that include a library, printing presses, especially including special presses for music and mathematics, a cabinetry workshop, a pharmacy, the kitchens and their gardens, a foundry and a mint, a map room, and so forth. And here, just so this is a little bit easier to read, these are all of the specific workshops that Quiccheberg proposes as an apparatus surrounding the Kunstkammer proper. Conceptually, then, these facilities frame the Kunstkammer. They are where the objects and devices of the collection are maintained, where many of them are made, and occasionally made by the princes themselves. From these laboratories and workshops, the productive, i.e. the technical knowledge gained from the collection is to be put into practical use in relation to the larger economy and state. Artisans from outside the court can learn new techniques and then introduce them to the rest of the world. Part of their function is the upkeep of the princely household, producing medicines, building and repairing furniture, printing decrees, and forging arms, locks, and horseshoes. It is Quiccheberg's workshop system connected to the Kunstkammer that most strongly illustrates the idea of these collections as an apparatus for the administration of the state, and that demonstrates the potential influence that he had on other major early modern collections. I'm thinking here particularly of the form that Francesco Primo de' Medici's studiolo took in the early 1570s. It is noteworthy that in 1565, Francesco had traveled to Austria to collect his bride, Joanna of Austria. This is the same year that Albrecht V formally established his Kunstkammer as a state institution, and the same year in which Quiccheberg's treatise was printed. Along the way, Francesco visited Vienna, Ambras, and Munich, after which he reorganized the Medici studiolo as the focal point of a set of laboratories and workshops, including the glass-blowing furnace, where by legend he personally invented a technique for blowing vessels from rock crystal. The Medici dukes, in conjunction with their laboratories, lured Venetian glassmakers to Florence from Murano to produce both luxury glassworks of the highest quality, such as these two pieces in the style of Bortolo d'Alvise, as well as mirrors and optical glass of the highest quality for scientific instruments. Less directly, we might think of other princely examples of establishing and personally working within workshops, such as the alchemical experimentation at the court of Landgrave Moritz of Hesse, Wilhelm IV of Bavaria's interest in woodwork and especially wood turning, Archduke Ferdinand II of Tyrol's passion for metallurgy and locksmithing, as well as for collecting arms and armor, and his founding of a Tyrolean glassworks, and the fixation of Duke August of Saxony with collecting tools and instruments. Now, when I began to looking to see where else I might find the linkage that I had identified between techne and the craft of good governance, and what I am suggesting is an attempt at a kind of unified field theory of Aristotelian wisdom, I located a second 16th century treatise that does something very similar, although in talking about a very different sort of topic. And this is Christophorus Mylaeus's De Scribendo Universitatis Rerum Historia, which was first published in Florence in 1548, and then in a series of editions for several decades. Conveniently, we can confirm that Quiccheberg was familiar with Mylaeus's book, since he specifically mentions it in the Inscriptiones, albeit only to draw a distinction between how Mylaeus uses the word theatrum metaphorically. He describes the collection of knowledge of history as a kind of theater, whereas Quiccheberg uses theater quite concretely in reference to the appropriate architecture for displaying and viewing a collection. Nonetheless, Quiccheberg knew Mylaeus's treatise. The treatise ostensibly teaches the reader how to write history, quite literally, of everything, of the entire universe. What it actually provides is a summary history of the universe. The treatise is divided into 5 books, which treat in order the history of nature, the history of prudence, the history of rulership or governance, the history of philosophy, and the history of literature, or, with deference to Vera Keller's objections to calling it the history of literature, it's really the history of learning. At least I think that would be the appropriate translation. In other words, it's a sequence proceeding from the physical universe to the knowledge that can be derived from it. Mylaeus's treatise appeared in, as I said, numerous editions between 1548 and 1668, as well as a version printed as a single, enormously wide Ramus diagram in 1557. I've been working with one particular edition, which is the 1551 Basel Operinus edition, because it includes a paratextual apparatus, that's the right way of phrasing it, of transitional excurses linking each of the book. In other words, you get book 1 and then an excursus, which is a transition from the first book to the second book, and then another one between the second and third, and so forth. And these excurses explain metacritically Mylaeus's rationale for the sequence of the arguments that he produces. And I should note that the translation of Mylaeus that I'll be using today was prepared by a young British scholar, Natalie Cobo, who's done a wonderful job of tackling book 2 on the history, which is the history of prudence, as well as the 2 excurses that frame it. And actually, let me make an aside here. What we are hoping one of the byproducts of today's symposium will be not only a volume of collected essays, but an accompanying volume of primary texts in translation upon which our various talks are predicated. In the excursus that leads into Book 2, the History of Prudence, Mylaeus provides some insight into his definition of prudence. He begins by noting that we are made up of body and mind and are therefore born for two things, to do and to understand. Prudence thus relates to the things that are pertinent to the body and for the various actions needed to sustain human life. He thus starts by separating prudence from Aristotelian episteme. Prudence is practical while philosophy is not, as he then further explains. We have prudence for handling matters which are disturbed, varying, doubtful, fortuitous, and susceptible to change in the human sphere. And we are accustomed to use it for all things that require consultation and deliberation. But wisdom, sapientia, contemplates and considers things of a single kind, which are steady and eternal, need no discussion, and do not change. They are long-lasting and endure. In other words, as Aristotle stated, prudence is a specific form of knowledge that contends with contingent, changing circumstances that require constant analysis. The instability that the instability that prudence addresses within the context of a treatise on writing history, on the universe perceived fundamentally in temporal terms. He's interested in a sequence from the past to the present. In this, they lead Mylaeus to argue for the progressive nature of prudence. And in so doing, he seems to be heading in the direction of conflating or eliding prudence and techne. Artis, is the name given to the knowledge of how to do something and obtain results. Accordingly, many things in life are achieved not rashly, accidentally, or fortuitously, but by tried and tested methods. They are completely confirmed by long and varied experience, reflection, and the recording of observations and practice. Therefore, men considerate of progress and desirous of the public good, since here we have the opportunity to elaborate on things necessary for progress of matters, more fully and examine that part of the mind concerned with action. The Greeks most appropriately called this excellent virtue prudence, from understanding, and the Romans from making provision, providio. The way Mylaeus begins the second book of his treatise on the history of prudence is in fact then to offer a developmental and explicitly progressive history of human technical inventiveness, of techne, in response to the basic needs all humans face. And I quote, "It is praiseworthy that everybody has an innate instinct whereby the older generation principally strives to leave abundant things, whether basic or elaborate, to their own people as part of the perpetual progression of mankind." The result in Mylaeus' treatise is a series of brief narratives that begin by imagining the most primitive human conditions and then predicating the sequence of invention that lead to humanity's current, i.e. 16th century condition. And I have to say, this is the most non-visual talk I've ever delivered, so I'm throwing in a couple images along the way. The book begins, for example, Mylaeus' second book on prudence begins with food. Humans first gathered herbs and fruits and learned to distinguish what is healthy from what was dangerous, which was as instinctual as an infant suckling from its mother's breast. They then developed agriculture and animal husbandry to secure more stable sources of nourishment. With the discovery of metal, improved farming implements were invented, as is the fertilization of fields. Mylaeus then moves on to discuss the cultivation of grapes and the invention of wine, the discovery that pruning trees leads to better tasting fruit, the introduction of beekeeping and dairy farming, the invention of the millstone and the baking of bread, the appearance and proliferation of food-related professions, including those of the baker, the butcher, and the professional cook, and then on to such culinary refinements as confectioners. The development of clothing, from simple leaves, bark, and animal skins to refined silks and brocades, comes next, followed by attending to the body, including the invention of cosmetics and medications. This point, Mylaeus turns to the problem of finding shelter. Just another couple of images about the invention of architecture. After bodily maintenance had been attended to, care was taken over residence and the home. Early men best and most efficiently protected themselves from injuries caused by the weather mutually together with their kin and relatives, because it was neither comfortable nor safe to stand guard all day and night. In the beginning, they tended to shut themselves in tree hollows in the woods and hide themselves in caves and pits, the common home of wild animals. Then, when the age was still young, it seemed more convenient to use places that had been equipped for this. They would lie down on these more comfortably and establish residences with their flocks and herds for night times. This is Mylaeus' description of man's most primitive condition. He then proceeds. Later, men in groups came to prefer stable habitations. Progress is always made from small beginnings to something greater, because the more we do something, the better we become at it. Again, cognitio. And so they soon made better homes by trying to imitate the simple talent of birds with mud, straw, reeds, and rods. They skillfully built houses and cottages that were enclosed with roofs to check the heat and annoyances of summer weather and repel the cold and storms. In these places lived wives, children, neighbors, friends, and servants, joined together by a spirit of sociability and common work. They later learned to make these buildings better and considerably stronger by weaving together closely chopped brushwood, twigs, branches, and leaves with worked clay. Once architecture is created, the pace of the narrative increases. Humans build more elaborate buildings with specialized bedrooms, dining rooms, storage rooms, kitchens, and so forth, each of which requires specialized furnishings. Thus, we get cabinet makers and lathe workers to produce furniture, potters to make earthenware, ivory workers to make combs and vases, glass makers to produce windows, mirrors, and drinking glasses, and so forth. With the discovery of metals comes a host of other invention, tools for agriculture, transport, homes, and military and naval matters, as well as keys, locks, hinges, bolts, nails, plowshares, hoes, scythes, anchors, and practically innumerable other things, including horology and orreries, with a nod to Wolfram Körper and the objects that we were able to view in the Met yesterday. The list of skilled crafts that Mylaeus discusses in this way are far too numerous for me to go through here, but they include paper and bookmaking, painting, chemistry, gardening, music and musical instrument making, shipbuilding and navigation, and so forth. Up to this point, the history of prudence that Mylaeus offers is, to all intents and purposes, actually a history of human productive inventiveness, which is to say, a history of techne. I know of no other text from the period that aligns the two things in this way, not even Quiccheberg. Andrew and I were discussing the iconography of prudence before the symposium, and neither of us could think of a single early modern image that presents the personification of prudence in explicit reference to craft, tools, and instruments, or other ways of producing techne. This elision seems to be something, at least as far as I know at the moment, that is unique to Mylaeus. That said, he does not leave things there. And in the interest of time, I will just summarize how he proceeds from this point, ultimately to bring things towards government and governance, which, after all, is the subject of the next book in the treatise. The needs of human communities, for those who can specialize in different tasks, leads to a diversified and stratified economy and society, with specialists in various crafts, but also specialists in various aspects of administration. Thus, governments emerge with specialists in each of the tasks that this requires. And I do think that within the context of this argument, he sees governing itself as a craft. In other words, there is a techne of governance as well. The diversification of administrative tasks, of course, includes a chief executive, a prince. Crafts and technology also produce wealth, which leads to larger communities and to splendid buildings, including the palace of the prince. This, too, requires furnishing, including painting, sculpture, tapestry, and furniture. Anything, as he says, in the entire world that is special and rare tends to be brought to the prince. In other words, he is speaking about the very earliest forms of princely collecting in this sense. Now, this brings the argument full circle, except that it is now the needs of the prince to govern effectively, which at least in part means magnificently, that now employs techne at the service of the state. It is impossible to say for certain if Quiccheberg drew upon Mylaeus in constituting his own argument about the prudential utility of Techne in relation to collections, but it is certainly tempting to think so. Prudence, as used by Mylaeus and by Quiccheberg, is the form of wisdom that Aristotle discusses as especially suited to the needs of a ruler. It is the contingent, practical knowledge a prince or governor needs to respond to ever-changing circumstances. This explains why Mylaeus has placed this chapter after the book on nature, the source of materials, and the model that humans imitate, and he's placed the chapter before that on governance. What he describes in this book are the adaptations that humans made to the natural world that lead to safety, health, security, and ultimately advanced civilization and political history discussed in the third book. These are the technical and technological achievements that the modern governments of Mylaeus's and Quiccheberg's day deployed at the service of the public good. Thank you.
We have just time for a couple of questions. Yes. So.
I was wondering if there is any connection between Quiccheberg and Mylaeus and Machiavelli. I haven't heard Machiavelli being mentioned in relation to prudence and governance.
I think this is a really distinct strain of discussion of Aristotelian prudence that is at variance to Machiavelli.
Right, I thought so, yes. But even at variance, there is no polemic or sense that it's being taken into account.
Vera assures us that she will be addressing this, and she's our next speaker.
Oh, right.
No, Machiavelli is never mentioned. Nor is the model of prudence discussed in Mylaeus contrasted with any other model of prudence, including Machiavelli. So the polemic does not appear there, but we will learn more about it shortly.
Thank
you. Peter?
Just to follow up on Francesco's question, the polemic doesn't enter into this literature. Does that suggest that already at this stage, the topic of this conference was already live? That's to say, the discussion, think about the criticism of Machiavelli in the second half of the 16th century, where he's already become infamous for his thinking about prudence. That's already seen as, these are two literatures that never meet, two groups of scholars who never communicate. Why do you think prudence, as used by Machiavelli, was in such disfavor at the same time that Quiccheberg is trying to present it as something very favorable and seems like he can do it without worrying about the infamy?
Vera assures me she will also be addressing
Good question.
The only answer I can give is I have no evidence whatsoever that Quiccheberg turns in that direction, or Mylaeus either. There's no hint of any awareness on their part of either the text or the debate. So in other words, they are going directly back to Aristotle as a way of explaining and justifying the arguments that they wish to put forward. The earliest surviving text we have from Quiccheberg is actually a moderation of a debate on medicine that was conducted at Ingolstadt University. And again, he's bringing in Aristotle as a framing device for that debate. So I simply think that Aristotle, as it were, directly was part of his training, and his overall concern, Quiccheberg's overall concern, and I mentioned in passing that this is really a kind of job application for him, is to assure princes that he can do something of the utmost utility for them so that they're going to be willing to give him a lifetime income. And the argument he advances is drawn upon, he turns to the ethics the treatise on, or the section of the treatise on governance as the appropriate way of addressing a prince in terms of the utility of governance. And I don't think he's terribly concerned about what other scholars have been doing with it. At least I've seen no evidence.
Just to comment on that, I mean, it depends whether we're talking about Machiavelli, the Prince, or Machiavelli, the Discourses, because in the Discourses he says, you know, what we need is practical wisdom. I mean, it's a larger political discourse about governing, I would say, that I agree, Mylaeus probably didn't, engage with Machiavelli, but there is a larger political discourse that has compared medicine and the practical knowledge needed for medicine to the knowledge of governing for, a very long time. So, and Machiavelli references that specific or explicitly in the Discourses.
I think, alas, we must stop here. There will be time to take up these very interesting issues at the end, and of course in the breaks. But thank you, Mark, for setting the stage, as it were, with an extremely wonderful and dynamic